Today, I'm finally able to show you how AMD's new Ryzen 7 9800X 3D performs, and spoiler alert, it is a real weapon that's thankfully able to solve the issues faced by the non-3D Zen 5 base models, making it without question the best CPU to be released since the 7800X 3D. So finally, something exciting. Today's sponsor spot is brought to you by MSI and their GeForce RTX 40 series graphics cards, including the brand new Wukong edition RTX 4070 Super. This special edition model is based on MSI's gaming slim design, meaning it occupies just 2 expansion slots. And because this is the Wukong edition, it comes with a stunning custom designed shroud and backplate, along with upgraded Torx 5.0 fans and Tri-Frozer 3 cooling. NVIDIA's Ada Lovelace GPUs are the best way to enjoy ray tracing, with improved, more realistic visuals and lighting in the latest and greatest games like Black Myth Wukong, Alan Wake 2 and Cyberpunk 2077. Plus, there's support for AI-powered DLSS 3 frame generation and reflex. So for more information, please check the links in the video description. Now, like all X3D models, the 9800X3D takes advantage of AMD's 3D V-Cache technology, this time using a second generation, which in short just flips the orientation. Whereas the previous models all featured a large 64MB L3 cache laid on top of the cores, the second generation version now sits below the cores. AMD has discovered that the cores are more temperature sensitive than the 3D V-Cache, so by flipping them, the cores face significantly less thermal resistance, and AMD is claiming 46% less resistance, which means cooler operating temperatures, and therefore the 9800X3D runs 500 MHz higher than the 7800X3D for the base clock, and then 200 MHz higher for the boost. So in a nutshell, all of this means the 9800X3D enjoys better thermals, higher clock speeds, and therefore greater performance, which of course we will look at shortly. Now, what hasn't changed with the 9800X3D and Zen 5 in general is the memory support, and there's been quite a bit of confusion around this topic, not just with Zen 5, but also the new 800 series chipsets, and I'm doing new in air quotes since it's merely a refresh. Now, the IMC or integrated memory controller isn't part of the Zen cores or Zen architecture, and it's not even housed in the CCD. Rather, the unified memory controller can be found in the I/O die. Both Zen 4 and Zen 5 use the exact same I/O die, manufactured using TSMC's N6 FinFET process, which is different to the N4 FinFET process used by the Zen 5 cores, or the N5 FinFET process used by the Zen 4 cores. So, since both Zen 4 and Zen 5 use the same I/O die, with the same IMC, memory support on the processor side is exactly the same, and this means DDR5 6000 at a 1:1 ratio is the sweet spot, but both can handle up to DDR5 8000 at a 2:1 ratio, and therefore DDR5 8000 support is not a new feature of the Zen 5 architecture. And AMD has been very clear on this messaging to reviewers since the introduction of the Zen 5 architecture. DDR5 6000 with a memory clock of 3000 MHz at a 1:1 ratio, so 3000 MHz IMC clock with the fabric clocked at 2000 MHz is the sweet spot. Using DDR5 6200 to 6400 memory while maintaining a 1:1 ratio is far from guaranteed. Some silicon will do it, but not all. So showing this data as sort of the default behavior for Zen 4 or Zen 5 is inaccurate and does misrepresent what these processors are generally capable of, short of winning the silicon lottery, of course. Then there's the chipsets, and even less has changed here. In fact, other than the name, there are no physical changes to the chipset. AMD has simply renamed X670E, for example, to X870E. So you don't need an X870E motherboard for DDR5 8000 support, as I've seen many people claiming. And in fact, I've found most X870/X870E boards aren't even stable at that frequency, at least with the BIOSes that we used at the time of testing. So DDR5 8000 support will depend on the individual AM5 motherboard. Now for testing the 9800X3D, so the good stuff. I'm sticking with our default AM5 test system using the Gigabyte X670E Aorus Master. Again, X670E, this isn't a problem, guys. You're not going to be seeing more performance with an X870E motherboard. They're the same thing. But I have also validated all of our data on a second AM5 test system featuring the MSI Pro X870-P Wi-Fi, and both boards did deliver the same results. So that's a nice sanity check. And with all of that, let's actually go check out the data. Firstly, here's a look at how the 9800X3D behaves under an all-core workload running Cinebench 2024. Now, what's interesting to note here is that although the 9700X has a 5.5 GHz boost frequency, in this workload it only sustained a frequency of 5225 MHz, and as luck would have it, this is the exact same frequency the 9800X3D runs at. But because of the included 3D V-cache, it does require more power to sustain this frequency. During our test, we saw an average package power of 118 watts, but despite this, the CCD temperature never went above 79 degrees, while the L3 cache ran at a cool 56 degrees, and these results were recorded using the MSI Mag Core Liquid i360. Okay, so here's how the 9800X3D performs in the Cinebench multi-core test, and while certainly not impressive when compared to core-heavy parts, the result itself is still very impressive. Despite running at the same frequency as the 9700X, the 9800X3D managed to score 1,384 points, which is a 7% increase, and this is quite unexpected. And it means that the 3D V-cache is entirely responsible for this performance gain. And it's unexpected because traditionally the 3D V-cache parts have performed lower than their non-3D versions for most productivity workloads. The 7800X3D, for example, is 5% slower than the 7700X, though it does clock 6% lower, but even if you were to eliminate the clock speed variable, the 7700X and 7800X3D would deliver near identical performance in this workload. So, how is the 9800X3D 7% faster than the 9700X at the same frequency? I have to assume here, this is speculation, but I believe the I/O die is the limiting factor here, creating a bottleneck that the 9800X3D helps mitigate with its much larger L3 cache buffer. Because other than the 3D V-cache, the only difference between these two parts is the TDP, but given they're hitting the same clock frequencies in this test, the TDP shouldn't be a factor. Outside of those variables, they're being tested on the same motherboard, with the same version of Windows, using the same DDR5 6000 memory with the same timings. It's really the same everything. It's also worth noting that our reported scores for the 9700X and 9800X3D match what AMD are reporting in their review guide. So we can rule out any kind of issues on our end. These results, at least according to AMD, are accurate. So some really interesting stuff already for the 9800X3D. It's also really interesting to learn that the single-core performance of the 9800X3D and 9700X is virtually identical, with less than a percentage separating them. This again suggests that with all cores active, the I/O die becomes the primary bottleneck, but with just a single core active, we don't run into what is likely a bandwidth-related issue. Now, when measuring power consumption via the EPS 12-volt rails during the Cinebench multi-core test, we see that the 9800X3D consumed 128 watts, which is a massive 54% increase when compared to the 7800X3D, though it was 24% faster. Still, it did consume slightly less power than the 7700X and considerably less than the 285K and 14900K, and I should note that the 285K we were measuring from the EPS 12-volt rails on an MSI motherboard, so not the ASUS Hero, where some of the power is routed through the 24-pin ATX power cable. Anyway, those Intel processors were also much faster in this workload, so it's not exactly a fair comparison. Obviously, the 9800X3D is not a productivity processor, but we're going to look at a few more productivity tests anyway before jumping into those gaming benchmarks that I know you're all here for. For an 8-core processor, it has to be said the 9800X3D is impressively fast in the 7-zip compression test, roughly matching the 12900K, making it 11% faster than the 9700X and 7800X3D. The decompression performance is also impressive when compared to the other 8-core processors, beating the 9700X by a 6% margin and the 7800X3D by a 9% margin. Still, when compared to the 285K, it is 31% slower, so you'll have to wait for the 9950X3D if you're interested in strong productivity performance from an X3D part. And given what we've seen here from the 9800X3D, the 9950X3D should be really something quite special. Now, the 9800X3D smashes the 9700X in Blender, offering 18% greater performance, making it just 7% slower than the Core i9-12900K. The 9800X3D is even better in Corona, beating the 9700X by a massive 20% margin. That is an incredible performance uplift for what is essentially the same CPU, just with the addition of that 3D V-cache. And if you compare the previous gen parts, such as the 7700X and 7800X3D, you see that the 3D V-cache part is actually slower. So this strongly suggests to me that the Zen 5 architecture is significantly better than how it's being represented by parts such as the 9700X. And as I've said, the I/O die has to be the problem here, and many have suspected this ever since the Zen 5 reviews were first published. The 9800X3D also performs well in Photoshop, comfortably topping our chart, making it 8% faster than the 9700X. The Intel CPUs aren't even competitive here, as the 9800X3D is 21% faster than the 285K. Even in Premiere Pro, the 9800X3D is 11% faster than the 9700X, making it one of the fastest CPUs in this test and just 14% slower than the 285K. So this makes me even more excited for a part like the 9950X3D. But in the meantime, we have the gaming benchmarks to check out, and this is where the 9800X3D should really shine. And holy moly, does it shine. This is some serious jaw-dropping performance in Star Wars Jedi Survivor. 234 FPS makes the 9800X3D an impressive 14% faster than the 7800X3D, which is obviously an already incredibly fast gaming processor. That is a 45% uplift over the 9700X, and wait for it, a 43% increase over Intel's best, the 14900K, and if you want to include it, 51% faster than the 285K. Again, that is certainly jaw-dropping performance that leaves Intel in no man's land. But maybe this data is an outlier. Well, thankfully not. The Last of Us Part 1 results and margins aren't quite as extreme, but even so, the 9800X3D sits comfortably at the top of our graph with 208 FPS, a 6% increase over the 285K and 9% ahead of the 14900K. It's also 6% faster than the 7800X3D, certainly not a massive gain, but still we're talking about what was previously the best performer in this example. The Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty data is also very impressive. Here the 9800X3D was 8% faster than the 7800X3D, making it 33% faster than the 14900K and 45% faster than the 285K. We're also looking at a 35% increase over the 9700X, thanks to the addition of the 3D V-cache. So again, the 9800X3D doesn't exactly destroy the 7800X3D in this example, but even so, at an 8% increase over an already very fast CPU, this is impressive. But hold on to your hats, the 9800X3D is eye-wateringly fast in Hogwarts Legacy, driving up to 170 FPS in this very CPU-limited title. And when I first saw these numbers, I didn't really believe my eyes, but after several checks, it's true. The 9800X3D is a monster, beating the 7800X3D by a 21% margin. And incredibly, that made it 37% faster than the 14900K and 43% faster than the 285K. And this is certainly a game where you will notice that additional performance. It really doesn't matter what resolution you run at here. The 14900K will limit you to around 124 FPS in the MPC heavy section that we use for testing, whereas the 9800X3D will enable a truly high refresh rate experience. Now, we know from past testing that ACC is very cache sensitive, and as a result, the 3D V-cache parts have always performed exceptionally well. For example, the 5800X3D is beating everything that doesn't feature 3D V-cache, smoking the 14900K by a 14% margin. And that being the case, it's no surprise to see that the 9800X3D is a real weapon, allowing for 269 FPS to be rendered, making it 14% faster than the 7800X3D, 45% faster than the 9700X, and an insane 61% faster than the 14900K. Oh, and it's also 75% faster than the 285K. The 9800X3D powered through Remnant II, boosting the average frame rate from the 7800X3D by 14%, though we did only see a very minor increase to the 1% lows. Still, that meant the 9800X3D was 25% faster than the 9700X and 31% faster than the 285K. Now, the 9800X3D is the first CPU to push 1% lows over 60 FPS in the Homeworld 3 benchmark, making it up to 21% faster than the 7800X3D and 16% faster when comparing the average frame rate. And this made it 46% faster than the 9700X, 53% faster than the 14900K, and 58% faster than the 285K. Pretty insane stuff. The 7800X3D was only 12% faster than the 7700X in A Plague Tale Requiem, yet despite that, the 9800X3D is 20% faster than the 9700X, which is seriously impressive given that the 9700X is a little bit faster than the 7700X in this title. This means the 9800X3D is 10% faster than the 7800X3D and a massive 31% faster than the 14900K. The 285K appears broken in this title right now, so I'm not sure how relevant this data is, but in any case, the 9800X3D is nearly 60% faster. The 9800X3D is a beast in Counter-Strike 2, pushing the RTX 4090 to 668 FPS. And that's a 13% increase over the 7800X3D and nearly 30% faster than the 14900K. It was also 27% faster than the 9700X, so again the 3D V-Cache is providing great gaming gains. Oddly, the Zen 5 parts that we initially received were surprisingly weak in Starfield. The 9700X, for example, was 9% slower than the 7700X. But this issue does not apply to the 9800X3D, as it was 21% faster than the 7800X3D and 37% faster than the 9700X. It was also able to beat Intel's best, offering an 11% increase over the 14900K and 10% over the 285K. And this is a very memory-intensive game, so I have to imagine, again, the I/O die is creating a huge bottleneck for that 9700X. We're also looking at strong gains in Space Marine 2. Here, the 9800X3D is 10% faster than the 7800X3D, which meant it was 23% faster than the 14900K and 27% faster than the 285K. We're also looking at a 28% uplift from the 9700X. The 9800X3D is also able to take the lead in Hitman 3, offering 8% better performance than the 7800X3D, which allowed it to overtake the 14900K by a slim 5% margin. Still, as one of the better gaming benchmarks for Intel, it's surprising to see them lose in this example. Now, the 9800X3D was able to nudge ahead of the 7800X3D in Watch Dogs Legion, offering an additional 6% performance, making it 19% faster than the 14900K and 36% faster than the 285K. Finally, we have Star Wars Outlaws, and despite being a heavily CPU-limited title, the 9800X3D really doesn't offer that much here. It's just 10% faster than the 9700X, and this saw it just match the 14900K and 7800X3D. I'm not entirely sure what the limiting factor is here. Other sections of the game will see frame rates climb much higher than 142 FPS, but in the NPC heavy section that we're testing here, this appears to be the current limit. Now for a look at power consumption when gaming. In Cyberpunk 2077, the 9800X3D is extremely efficient, consuming 93 watts, which means it uses 11% more power than the 9700X for a 35% increase in performance. It was also a 36% power saving when compared to the 285K for 45% more performance. It also stacks up really well in The Last of Us Part 1, consuming just 95 watts, the same level of power as the 9700X for 16% greater performance. Also, this time it consumed 34% less power than the 285K for 6% greater performance. So the 9800X3D not only murders Intel's latest flagship offering in terms of FPS performance, but it also does so in terms of power efficiency. Okay, so here it is, the 14-game average, and there's a lot to digest here. Firstly, while AMD claimed on average that we'd see an 8% uplift over the 7800X3D, we're happy to report in our testing the uplift was 11%, so even better than what AMD claimed. That's also a truly impressive improvement over what was already the world's fastest gaming processor. Sure, it's not nearly as impressive as the 24% increase the 7800X3D offered over the 5800X3D, but given how disappointing the initial wave of Zen 5 products was, 11% is pretty great stuff. It also means Intel's now facing a historic loss when it comes to gaming performance, with the 9800X3D crushing the 14900K by a 27% margin. That is an incredible deficit that only gets worse when you include the 285K, as the 9800X3D wins that matchup by a 33% margin. And those are unheard of margins. It wasn't that long ago that some PC enthusiasts made a big deal out of Intel having, on average, a 5% lead over AMD. And while I personally never considered 5% to be statistically significant, 27 to 33% certainly is. Now here's a closer look at how the 9800X3D and 9700X compared on a per game basis. As you can see, we saw a few examples of gains at or around 45%, which is incredible. Not only that, but half of the games tested saw gains of 30% or greater, which is why the 9800X3D was on average 30% faster than the 9700X. Then when compared to the 7800X3D, as you just saw, we found that the 9800X3D was on average 11% faster, though we did see gains as high as 21%. There were also a handful of single-digit margins and just a single example where performance went unchanged. Now, when compared to the 14900K, it's an easy win for the 9800X3D, offering on average 28% greater performance when calculating the margins on a per-game basis. It's also wild to see so many examples where the 9800X3D was offering over 30% greater performance, and then so few examples where the results were actually competitive. Then we have the 285K matchup, which really isn't a matchup at all, as the 9800X3D manages to make the 285K look like an entry-level gaming CPU. There are just 4 examples where the performance is somewhat competitive, with 10 where it's just a slaughter. Okay, so time for the all-important cost per frame data, and at this point I should really note that the MSRP has been set at $480 US, which is a $30 US premium over the 7800X3D and 5800X3D. So AMD clearly knows it's onto a winner here, and even at $480 US, it blows the Intel competition out of the socket. And not just in terms of raw FPS performance, but also value. The 9800X3D comes in 14% better value than the 14900K, and 43% better value than the 285K. Of course, the 285K is much better for productivity, but if you primarily care about gaming performance, then Intel doesn't really have anything for you right now. Now, PBO. There are a few different ways to enable it, and for our testing, we did manually enable PBO via the BIOS. For this, we enabled PBO Advanced, which sets the PPT, TDC, and EDC limits automatically. We then set the PBO scaler to 10 times, and the CPU boost clock overdrive was set to plus 200 MHz. Finally, the curve optimizer was set to -20, and this was stable with our CPU. Now, this only boosted our Cinebench multi-core score by 2.5%, so nothing to get excited about there. We also only saw a 3% increase to the single-core score, so again, nothing to get excited about. Disappointingly, these minor performance improvements did see the power usage increase by a whopping 20%, so if you care about power efficiency, this PBO configuration won't be for you. Testing with Star Wars Jedi Survivor only saw a 3% increase in performance, so again, pretty underwhelming stuff there. Remnant II only saw a 2% increase with PBO, so while still amazing performance overall, it's probably not worth the effort, nor the increased power usage, or the fact that you are risking system stability by doing this. Then we have Hitman 3. We did see a 4% performance increase, but even that's a pretty weak uplift given the trade-offs. Now, just lastly, I wanted to look at memory scaling performance, and for this I've got half a dozen G-Skill memory kits, which I'll be trying on the X670E Aorus Master motherboard. I should also note again that you do not require X870E motherboards for DDR5 8000 support. The X870E chipset is a straight refresh of X670E, so That is to say, they are the exact same thing. For memory speeds above 6400, I'm using a 2:1 ratio, and all configurations are running at a 2000 MHz fabric frequency. It's also worth noting that the memory support for the 9800X3D, and Zen 5 in general, is the same as Zen 4, so parts like the 7800X3D and 9800X3D will be the same in that regard. The memory controller is housed in the I/O die, and both Zen 4 and Zen 5 use the exact same I/O die, and therefore memory support is exactly the same. Sorry to be repeating myself for those of you who watched the entire video to this point, but some people skip to, the benchmark sections, so again, apologies. So for example, all of the following memory configurations will work with the 7800X3D, provided you have a suitable motherboard. Now, although Cinebench 2024 can be sensitive to memory performance, we're seeing very little change in performance between the 6 memory configurations tested, and no change in the data when looking at single-core performance. As for gaming, Star Wars Jedi Survivor is a memory-sensitive title, and here we see that our review kit of DDR5 6000 CL30 memory does provide optimal performance for the 9800X3D. Upgrading to low latency DDR5 8000 memory only improves performance by 1.3% in this example, while CL40 8000 is 1.7% slower. And it's much the same story in Remnant II. Here the 6000 CL30 kit provided 158 FPS on average, and 8000 CL36 was only able to improve upon this result by 1.2%. Then finally, in Hitman 3, we're looking at less than a 2% variation in performance between the slowest and fastest memory configurations tested, so my recommendation remains the same. Go with DDR5 6000 memory and get the lowest latency stuff that makes sense or you can afford. Finally, an exciting product worth buying. It has been rough out here, but as I said, we now have something that we can recommend you actually go out and purchase, even at the launch price. That said, if you were to go and snap up a 9800X3D right away, do so knowing it will almost certainly be cheaper in a few months' time, and it could end up being a lot cheaper in the not too distant future. AMD is typically very aggressive with their CPU pricing, and despite rave reviews and loads of interest from consumers, it only took around 3 months before the 7800X3D saw at least $50 slashed off the price, and then 6 months later, it received a $90 discount. Of course, price cuts for the 9800X3D, they're not going to be guaranteed, but based on past trends, they do seem highly likely. So if you're not desperately in need of that upgrade right away, it might pay a little bit if you wait. It's also worth noting that 5 months ago, the 7800X3D was retailing for as little as $340 US, and less than a month ago could be had for $420 US, though at that price it represents similar value to the 9800X3D. So, for the 9800X3D to match the value of a $340 US 7800X3D, it would need $100 US slashed off the price, dropping it down to $380 US. Still, as I said, the 9800X3D represents great value even at the $480 US MSRP, and while some will be disappointed with the small price hike, it is only $30, which is probably in line with inflation over the past few years anyway. But without going down that rabbit hole, when compared to what Intel has on offer, the 9800X3D is exceptionally good value, and of course we're looking at this purely from a gaming perspective, as the 9800X3D is a gaming CPU. Even with the outgoing discount applied to the 14900K, Intel just can't compete with the value of the 9800X3D, and they certainly can't compete in terms of performance. I don't care how good you think your memory tuning skills are, the Core i9 gets completely and totally annihilated, and that's even ignoring the obvious issues with power efficiency. All of that said, the 9800X3D has no competition right now, and therefore AMD could have almost certainly gotten away with charging even more. Thankfully they didn't, which I think long-term will prove to be a smart choice. Therefore, we've established that, at least in my opinion, the 9800X3D at $480 US is a good value product, based on the fact that it completely annihilates the competition, and even at its introductory price, the value is still there, especially considering it's a class-leading flagship product, and there's always a bit of a premium associated with being the best of the best. So based on that, I'm obviously very happy with the performance we're seeing, and therefore the uplift over the 7800X3D. Though, admittedly, an 11% improvement on average, it's not mind-blowing, and when compared to the generational gains that we've historically seen from AMD over the past 6 years, it's actually pretty weak. But given the current circumstances, this sort of improvement has wound up being tremendously exciting. This is due in part to the fact that the initial wave of Zen 5 products were extremely underwhelming, a flop in every sense of the word, offering low single-digit performance gains over the previous generation Zen 4 parts, and despite initial claims, there were no efficiency gains, at least for general desktop usage and gaming, and therefore, the price premium meant that in all instances, you were better off buying a Zen 4 part. And even today, Zen 4 is still better, which is why I say those Zen 5 parts are a flop. They need not exist. To date, they offer you nothing. Then you have competing parts from Intel, such as the 14900K, a part that has been plagued with stability and degradation concerns, though those issues should be addressed at this point in time, as long as you update your BIOS. Those issues aside though, the Core i9 is grossly inefficient, and more to the point, much slower than the 9800X 3D. There's also the new Core Ultra 9 285K, which at this point in time is slower than the 14900K for gaming. And while there's a chance Intel could improve gaming performance, it won't be to the degree that sees it competitive with a part such as the 9800X 3D. So, given all of that, an 11% uplift over the 7800X 3D ends up looking pretty great, and this result will almost certainly see the 9800X 3D sell like hotcakes. It does make you wonder though, why AMD even bothered with these standard Zen 5 parts to begin with, given that for the most part, they're really no faster than Zen 4, and the evidence suggests this is largely due to the I/O die. So maybe a better question is, why did AMD choose to gimp Zen 5 with the old I/O die from Zen 4, spoiling the product in the process? And an improved I/O die would almost certainly benefit the 9800X 3D as well. Anyway, there's no changing this now, but it does give me some hope that Zen 6 can deliver serious performance gains, assuming that AMD doesn't stick with the same I/O die for that release. So we'll just have to wait and see on that one. For now, the 9800X 3D is mighty impressive, the undisputed king of gaming, and it marks a historic point in time, as I don't think AMD has ever been this dominant over Intel, certainly not in the last 15 years. Seeing AMD beat Intel by an almost 30% margin for gaming beggars belief, and I'll admit I'm still having a hard time believing this is real, but apparently this is the situation in late 2024. And that is going to do it for my review of the 9800X 3D. Of course, we're going to have a lot more benchmarks, big 40 game head-to-heads with various different CPUs, so make sure you are subscribed to that. Also, don't forget to like the video. Yeah, subscribe, I think I already said that. We have the join button, that's a new thing, or Patreon. You can go to either one of those. It'll give you access to our exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, Q&A stuff, a lot of cool things there, so check it out if you're interested. But if not, that is perfectly fine, and I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.